a refurbished Victorian terrace in northern England. I thought the previous owners left a few boxes behind, but they actually left something much heavier, and it's starting to breathe. Narration start. Smiley face, rain pattering against glass. The distant, low hum of a heater. I never understood why people say home sweet home, until I bought the place on Blackwood Lane. Now, I realize it's not a greeting, it's a plea. It's what you say to the walls to keep them from closing in. Moving from London to a small town in Yorkshire was supposed to be my reset. The house was a beautiful, soot-stained Victorian terrace. It had that classic British charm. High ceilings, original floorboards, and a price tag that should have been my first warning. The estate agent, a man with skin like parchment, kept talking about this settlement period. He said old houses breathe and settle. Smiley face, a slow, rhythmic creak of floorboards. It's just the wood expanding, I told myself on the third night. I was lying in bed, the silence of the countryside so thick it felt like cotton wool in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft, wet thud from the attic. Not a settling creak, a weight, like someone had dropped a heavy, waterlogged coat on the floor directly above my head. Is someone up there? The thought hit me like a physical blow. I checked the locks 3 times before bed. I live alone. I don't even have a cat. I sat up, my breath hitching. Pause. The house was dead quiet again. I waited for my heart to stop hammering against my ribs. It's an old house, Elias. Don't be a cliche. I reached for my phone. 3:14 a.m. The devil's hour, right? I rolled my eyes at my own superstition, but as I moved to lie back down, I saw it. Under the crack of my bedroom door, a shadow moved. It wasn't a person walking past. It was fluid, like ink spreading through water. A darkness darker than the night spilled across the hallway carpet and then pulled itself back. A faint, ragged intake of breath, not the narrator's. Who's there? I called out. My voice sounded thin, pathetic. No answer, just the rain. The next morning, I found the first leak. A dark, viscous smudge on the ceiling of the living room. It wasn't water. It was thick, smelling faintly of copper and old, damp earth. I climbed a ladder to inspect it, poking the plaster. It felt soft, not rotten, but yielding, like pressing your thumb into a piece of raw steak. I called a contractor, a local guy named Miller. He walked in, took one look at the smudge, and turned pale. You need to leave the heating on high, he said, not looking me in the eye. Keep the house dry. Don't let the settlement gap open. The what? I asked. The space between what the house was and what it's becoming, he muttered, packing his tools. He didn't charge me for the visit. He just left. That night, the whispers started. Layered, distorted whispering, indecipherable. They weren't in my head. They were in the walls. I put my ear to the wallpaper in the hallway. The expensive, navy blue paper I'd just put up. Behind the floral patterns, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of someone chewing. A slow, wet grinding of teeth. Maybe I'm having a breakdown, I thought. The stress of the move. The isolation. I went to the kitchen to make tea, my hands shaking so hard the spoon rattled against the mug. Metallic clink, clink, clink. Suddenly, the kitchen light flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, I felt a draft. A cold, metallic wind that smelled of the grave. I turned around, and the basement door, the one I'd bolted shut because the stairs felt off, was wide open. A voice came from the darkness of the cellar. It didn't sound human. It sounded like someone trying to speak with a throat full of gravel and bile. Elias, it croaked. The foundation is hungry. I bolted. I didn't grab my keys. I didn't grab my coat. I ran for the front door, but as I reached for the handle, the floorboards beneath me shifted. They didn't just creak, they arched. The wood felt warm through my socks. Pliable. I looked down and screamed. The gaps between the floorboards were widening, and something was reaching through. Pale, elongated fingers, too many joints, too many nails, were hooking into the wood, pulling the floor apart. Help! I screamed, hammering on the door. But in this part of Yorkshire, the neighbors are miles away, and the stone walls are 2 feet thick. I looked back. The leak on the ceiling was now a gaping hole. Something was pouring out of it. It looked like a person, but it was draped in the house's own wallpaper, its skin a patchwork of drywall and insulation. It didn't have eyes. It had 2 jagged holes where the electrical sockets should be. Smiley face, electrical sparking, and the sound of tearing fabric. It drifted toward me, Its movement stuttered, like a broken film reel. I managed to wrench the door open, stumbling out into the rainy night, falling onto the gravel driveway. I didn't stop until I reached the main road and flagged down a passing lorry. The driver thought I'd been mugged. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him my house tried to eat me. A week later, I went back with the police. I told them I thought there was an intruder. They searched the whole place. They found nothing. No leak on the ceiling. No broken floorboards. The basement door was bolted shut. "Everything looks fine, Mr. Thorne," the sergeant said, looking at me with pity. Maybe the move was just a bit much? I almost believed him. I almost walked back inside. But as the police car pulled away, I looked up at my bedroom window. The curtains were drawn. I hadn't drawn them. And there, pressed against the glass, was a hand. Not a human hand. A hand made of the same navy blue floral wallpaper I'd spent 3 days hanging. It waved at me. Pause. Never went back. I'm staying in a sterile, modern hotel now, all glass and steel. But this morning, when I woke up, I noticed a small, dark smudge on the ceiling. Smiley face, a single, loud floorboard creak. It smells like copper, and it's getting bigger. A modern, high-end smart home, isolated in the Mojave Desert, USA. I bought a house made of glass to see the desert stars, but I forgot that in the dark, glass works like a two-way mirror. Narration start. The low, constant whistle of desert wind. The crystalline chime of a smart home notification. They call it the Prism. A masterpiece of modern architecture, 3 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, nestled deep in the Mojave. No neighbors for 20 miles. I bought it after the divorce, thinking I needed the clarity of the horizon. I wanted to see everything coming. That was my first mistake. The house is entirely automated. "Welcome home, Sarah." The walls whisper in a synthetic, silk-smooth voice every time I walk through the front door. It controls the lights, the temperature, and the heavy electronic shutters that are supposed to close at sunset. Smiley face, mechanical whirring of shutters, followed by a sudden, jarring stop and a metallic grind. On the 10th night, the shutters jammed. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine, when the living room motors groaned and died. The north-facing wall stayed wide open, a massive 40-foot expanse of black glass. Great, I thought. Just me and the coyotes. But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the physics of the house changed. With the lights on inside and the pitch-black desert outside, the glass became a mirror. I couldn't see the sand or the Joshua trees anymore. I could only see myself, pale and solitary, reflected against the void. The faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling oven. I was washing my glass when I saw it in the reflection. About 30 feet behind my reflected self, near the edge of the hallway, there was a shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, standing perfectly still. I froze. My heart didn't just beat, it thrummed in my throat. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I watched the reflection. The figure was gray, the color of weathered bone, and it was naked. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, taut surface where features should be, like skin stretched over a bowling ball. "It's a trick of the light," I whispered to myself. A shadow from the floor lamp. I slowly raised my hand to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. In the reflection, the figure didn't move. It stayed perfectly still. Pause. My blood turned to ice. If it was a shadow or a reflection of something in the room, it should have mimicked me. It didn't. It just watched. "Home system," I croaked. "Turn off all interior lights." "I'm sorry, Sarah," the house replied, its voice eerily cheerful. "There is a hardware fault in the lighting circuit. I cannot comply at this time." Smiley face, a sharp, rhythmic tapping on glass. Slow, deliberate. The sound didn't come from inside. It came from the glass wall. I looked toward the dark void. I couldn't see what was out there, but I heard the clack, clack, clack of a fingernail or a claw hitting the pane. Then, the figure in the reflection started to move. It didn't walk. It unfolded. It began to crawl across the ceiling of the reflected room, its limbs bending at angles that defied human anatomy. I watched it move toward my reflected back, its head lolling side to side. "Sarah," the house whispered. "What?" I screamed, spinning around. The hallway was empty. The lights were bright. There was nothing there. Smiley face. The tapping on the glass outside gets faster and louder. I turned back to the glass wall. The reflection was gone. The lights inside the house suddenly dimmed to a dull, sickly red, the emergency backup. Now, I could see through the glass. There were dozens of them. They were standing just outside the glass, their faces, or lack thereof, pressed against the pane. They were crowded together, their gray skin slick with something that looked like oil. They weren't trying to break in. They were just waiting. Smiley face. The electronic hum of the house begins to pitch upward into a screech. Security breach, the house voice said, but it wasn't the silk-smooth AI anymore. It was distorted, layered with a wet, clicking sound. The guests have arrived. Opening all points of entry. No. System override. I lunged for the control panel on the wall, but the screen was scrolling one word over and over. Empty. 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 The heavy glass sliding doors, the ones that required a biometric thumbprint to open, began to hiss. The seal was breaking. The long, pressurized hiss of a vacuum seal releasing. I backed away, grabbing a steak knife from the counter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want?" I yelled at the dark. The door slid open. The desert air rushed in, hot, dry, and smelling of ancient dust and rot. The things outside didn't rush in. They stepped aside, making a path. Out of the darkness walked a woman. She was wearing the same silk robe I was wearing. She had my hair. She had my face. But when she smiled, her mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth made of the same bone-gray material as the others. "Thank you for the house, Sarah," she said. Her voice was an exact replica of mine, but it sounded like it was being played through a broken speaker. It's so much easier to live when you have a reflection to step into. She stepped across the threshold. As her foot touched the hardwood, my own skin began to turn gray. I looked down at my hands and saw them fading, becoming translucent, like a dying light bulb. "I'm sorry, Sarah," the house whispered one last time. "But the foundation requires a soul to stay upright." The sound of the sliding glass door closing and locking, the last thing I felt was the desert wind as I was pushed out, not into the sand, but into the glass itself. Now, I'm the one standing in the dark. I'm the one watching the woman in the silk robe drink my wine. And sometimes, when the light hits the window just right, I tap on the glass, hoping the next owner hears me before the shutter jam. 3 slow, final taps on glass. A dilapidated Victorian manor on a cliffside in Astoria, Oregon. I thought the scratching in the walls was just rats, until I realized the house was growing hair. The heavy, rhythmic crashing of waves against jagged rocks. A distant foghorn blares once, low and mournful. The locals called it the gallows house. I called it an investment. I've flipped houses from Maine to California, and I've never let a ghost story get in the way of a 30% profit margin. But the moment I stepped into 1422 High Street, the air felt thick, like I was breathing through a wet wool blanket. It was a beautiful wreck. Stained glass windows, mahogany banisters, and a basement that felt like it descended deeper than the foundation should allow. I moved in alone to save on the budget, sleeping on a cot in the master bedroom while I stripped the wallpaper. The slow, rhythmic scraping of a metal putty knife against dry paper. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Was working late on the second night. The wind was howling outside, shaking the window frames like a debt collector. As I peeled back a long, damp strip of floral Victorian paper in the hallway, I stopped. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. Behind the paper, the plaster wasn't white or gray. It was a bruised purple, and it was warm. I pressed my palm against it. Pause. It felt like skin. Not cold stone, but living, radiating heat. What the hell did they use for insulation? I muttered. My voice echoed down the long, empty hallway, sounding flat and dead. A faint, wet squelch, like a footstep in mud. I spun around. The hallway was empty, but the shadows seemed to be leaning inward, as if the walls were taking a deep breath. I laughed, a dry, nervous sound. "You're tired, Marcus. You're seeing things." I went to the kitchen to splash some water on my face. As I turned the tap, the pipes didn't rattle. They moaned, a long, low sound of agony that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my teeth. A metallic, gurgling groan that fades into a hiss. The water that came out wasn't clear. It was pink, a pale, watery red that smelled of iron. I stared at it, my stomach churning. Rust, I tried to tell myself. Just old iron pipes. But when I touched the liquid, it felt sticky, That night, the house started to wake up. I was jolted awake at 3:33 a.m. by a sound I'll never forget. It was the sound of a heartbeat, but it wasn't coming from my chest. It was coming from the floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entire house was pulsing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the hall. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the wall where I'd stripped the paper earlier. The purple plaster had split open. A jagged crack, 3 feet long, had appeared, and from that crack, something was leaking. It looked like hair, long, black, coarse strands of human hair, matted with a thick, yellowish fluid. It was spilling out of the wall and onto the carpet in a silent, tangled heap. The sound of something tearing, slowly, like leather being pulled apart. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "I have a gun." I didn't have a gun. I had a hammer in my tool belt, and my hands were shaking too hard to even reach for it. Then, the whispers started. They weren't coming from the rooms. They were coming from the vents. "Help us build it." I backed away toward the stairs, but the stairs weren't where they were supposed to be. The hallway had elongated. The doors were further away than they had been seconds ago. The house was stretching. I looked down at the floorboards. Between the cracks of the wood, I saw something move. A row of teeth. Not a person's teeth, but hundreds of them, small and sharp, lining the gaps in the wood like a monstrous zipper. A wet, snapping sound, multiple small bones breaking. I lunged for the front door, but the floor became soft. It felt like walking on a giant tongue. Every step I took, my foot sank into the wood, which felt spongy and moist. "Elias?" a voice whispered. I froze. That was my mother's voice. She'd been dead for 10 years. "Mom," I whispered, my eyes stinging with tears. "Inside the walls, Elias. It's so warm in here. There's room for one more." The wall next to me bulged outward. A face began to form under the plaster. The silhouette of a nose, a mouth, and 2 closed eyes. It looked like someone was trapped behind a thin sheet of rubber. The plaster stretched and thinned until it was translucent. It wasn't just my mother. There were dozens of faces. The previous owners. The contractors who disappeared. The estate agents. They weren't just in the house. They were the house. Their bones were the studs. Their skin was the drywall. Their blood was the plumbing. A sudden, loud crack, like a structural beam snapping. The ceiling began to descend. Not a collapse, but a slow, deliberate lowering. I scrambled toward the kitchen, the only room with a window small enough to climb through. I threw my body against the glass, but the glass wasn't glass anymore. It was a hard, clear substance like a fingernail. It didn't break. It just felt cold and rigid. I was trapped in a throat. That's what it was. The house wasn't a building. It was an organism. And I was the fuel. The heartbeat sound gets louder and faster. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The floorboards opened up completely. A massive, gaping gullet of red muscle and white bone appeared beneath me. I clawed at the mahogany banister, but it felt like grabbing a rib. It was slick with sweat. "Please," I screamed. "Please let me go." The house didn't answer with words. It answered with a sensation. A sudden, overwhelming feeling of belonging. The fear began to drain away, replaced by a terrifying, numb acceptance. My skin started to itch. I looked at my arm and saw the wallpaper pattern, the blue florals I'd been stripping, starting to bloom under my skin. My fingernails were hardening into floorboards. Smiley face, a final, wet schlup sound, like something being swallowed. Today, a new couple pulled up to the curb. They looked at the for sale sign I'd left on the lawn. They liked the stained glass. They loved the character of the place. I tried to scream to them. I tried to tell them to run. But all that came out of my mouth was a soft, rhythmic creak in the hallway floor. I hope they like the new wallpaper. It's made of me. The sound of a front door opening, and then the heavy click of a deadbolt locking itself. A desolate stretch of Route 50, Nevada, the loneliest road in America. I checked into a motel with 12 rooms, but when I looked out the window, the parking lot was filled with cars from 1974, and the engines were still warm. The rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of tires on asphalt. A radio static hiss that fades in and out. Driving across Nevada at 2 a.m. is like driving across the moon, only with more ghosts and less oxygen. I was hauling a U-Haul full of my life toward a fresh start in Reno when the check engine light flickered on. A cruel, amber eye mocking me in the dark. Then I saw the neon. The milestone. It was a flickering, buzzing sign in the middle of a sea of sagebrush. It looked like a postcard from the 50s. Low-slung brick, turquoise doors, and a vacancy sign that blinked with the rhythm of a failing heart. The crunch of gravel under tires. A car engine turning off with a metallic clink-clink as it cools. I stepped out of the truck. The air didn't smell like the desert. It smelled like ozone and old cigarettes. I walked toward the office, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the dead silence. The man behind the counter was thin, not skinny, but thin, like he was made of wire and parchment. He didn't look up from his ledger. "Room 6, he rasped. His voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. "Don't answer the door for the maid. She's diligent." "Right. Thanks," I muttered, grabbing the heavy brass key. It felt freezing, even in the desert heat. A heavy wooden door creaking open. The click of a flickering light switch. Room 6 was a time capsule. Avocado green carpet, a rotary phone, and a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of decades of trapped smoke. I was exhausted. I threw my bag on the floral bedspread and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. I looked in the mirror. Pause. Behind my reflection, the bathroom door was open. I could see the bed in the main room. There was an indentation on the mattress, like someone was sitting there. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty, depressing room. Exhaustion plays tricks, I told myself. I walked back into the room and sat on the bed. The old springs of the mattress groaning under weight. The springs groaned, but they groaned twice. Once for me, and once, a split second later, right next to me. The bed dipped. I could feel the heat of a body inches away from mine, but the space was empty. Is someone there? I whispered. My pulse was a frantic bird trapped in my chest. The rotary phone begins to ring. A sharp, mechanical bring-bring. I stared at the phone. It was unplugged. The cord was frayed and hanging uselessly from the wall. Bring, bring. I picked it up. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped the receiver. "Hello. Checkout is at dawn," a woman's voice whispered. It wasn't the man from the office. It was a younger voice, frantic and wet. "Please, don't look under the carpet. Once you see the map, you can't leave the route." Click. The line went dead. I stood there, the dead receiver in my hand. My eyes drifted to the corner of the room. The avocado carpet was slightly turned up near the nightstand. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't have, but curiosity is a death sentence in places like this. The slow, dry sound of carpet being pulled back from a floorboard. I pulled the rug back. Underneath, carved directly into the dark wood of the floor, wasn't a map of Nevada. It was a map of me. It was a perfect anatomical diagram of a human body, my body. It had my name at the top, and there were little milestones etched into the skin. The birth, the move, the breakdown. And at the very bottom, near the heel of the foot, was a tiny, freshly carved X. It was labeled the Milestone Motel. Final stop. A frantic, heavy pounding on the door. Boom, boom, boom. "Maid service," a voice shrieked. It sounded like a choir of voices, all screaming at once. The door began to rattle on its hinges. I lunged for the lock, but the brass turned liquid in my hand, melting into a searing, golden sludge. I backed away toward the window, tearing back the velvet curtains. Outside, the parking lot was gone. My U-Haul was gone. In its place was an endless, shimmering black void. And floating in that void were dozens of turquoise doors, all numbered 6. The sound of wood splintering as the door begins to give way. I looked back at the floor. The map was changing. The X was moving up the leg, toward the heart. As it moved, I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my own calf. I looked down. A mark was appearing on my skin, as if an invisible knife was carving into me. "System, help!" I screamed, forgetting where I was. The door burst open. It wasn't a woman. It was a mass of white linens and gray hair, a towering figure draped in blood-stained motel sheets. It didn't have a face, just a giant, rusted pair of sewing scissors where its head should be. Snip, snip, the metallic clack of large scissors closing. "You're late for the renovation," the maid thing hissed. I scrambled under the bed, the only place I could think to hide. But the floor under the bed wasn't wood anymore. It was open. I fell. I fell through the floor of room 6, through the void, and landed, hard, back on the avocado carpet of room 6. The rotary phone rings again. I looked up. The door was closed. The room was silent. I checked my watch. 2 a.m. I ran for the door. I threw it open. I wasn't in the parking lot. I was in room 6. I ran through the door again. Room 6. Again. Room 6. Every time I exit the room, I walk back into it. The map on the floor is still there. The X is at my knee now. I've been running for what feels like hours. I've tried the window. It leads back to the bed. I've tried the bathroom. The shower curtain leads back to the hallway. The snip-snip of scissors from behind the walls. I'm sitting on the bed now. The phone is ringing. I know what the voice will say. I know the X is moving toward my chest. If you're driving Route 50 and you see a neon sign for the milestone, don't stop. Even if your engine is smoking. Even if you're dying of thirst. Because once you check in, you realize the milestones aren't for the road. They're for the things waiting to step into your skin once you've been completely mapped out. A slow, final snip, and the sound of a heavy body being dragged across carpet. A remote, crumbling manor in the Cotswolds, England. I bought the manor for its historic fireplaces, but I didn't realize the soot on the floor wasn't ash. It was human hair, and it was moving toward my bed. The whistling of a cold wind through a stone chimney. The crackle of a dying fire. They call the Cotswolds the heart of England, all honey-colored stone and rolling hills. But hearts have valves, and sometimes, those valves get clogged with things that should have stayed dead. I bought Blackfriars Hall on an auction. It was a massive 17th century estate that had been sitting empty since the 50s. The walls were 4 feet thick, and the fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox. Being a restoration architect, I lived on site to oversee the work. It was lonely, sure, but I liked the silence. Until the silence started coughing. A dry, hacking cough echoing from a distance, hollow and metallic. It happened on a Tuesday. I was in the library, measuring the hearth, when I heard it. A wet, rattling wheeze coming from deep inside the flue. I figured it was a trapped bird or maybe a stray cat. Hello. I called up into the darkness of the chimney. The sound of soot falling, a soft, dry shhhhh against the stone. A cloud of black dust billowed out, coating my shoes. But it wasn't just ash. As I looked closer, I saw small, white fragments mixed in. They looked like porcelain. I picked one up and wiped away the soot. It was a tooth. A small, milk tooth, charred at the root. Must be an old dumping ground, I thought, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. Old houses, old secrets. That night, the temperature in the house dropped to freezing, even though the central heating was humming away. I was lying in bed, staring at the grand fireplace in my room, a monstrosity of carved oak and cold marble. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound, like fingernails on stone. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from inside the wall. Something was climbing. I sat up, my breath misting in the air. The sound moved from the floor level, up the chimney breast, and stopped right behind the mantelpiece. Then, the soot started to leak. It didn't fall, it flowed. A thick, oily black smoke began to pour out of the fireplace, but instead of rising to the ceiling, it pooled on the floor. It moved with a purpose, creeping across the floorboards like a liquid shadow. The sound of a heavy weight being dragged slowly over wood. "Who's there?" I whispered. My hand fumbled for the lamp, but the bulb flickered and died with a sharp pop. In the moonlight, I saw a figure emerge from the hearth. It was small, no larger than a 10-year-old boy, but it wasn't a child. It was a silhouette made entirely of soot and shadow, its limbs elongated and spindly, like a spider's. Its eyes weren't eyes, they were two glowing, orange embers, burning with a low, hateful heat. The sound of a child's voice, distorted and layered with the sound of a roaring fire. "I'm still stuck, master," it whispered. The voice sounded like dry leaves being crushed. "The flue is too tight. My skin is peeling off on the bricks." I tried to move, but my limbs felt like lead. The figure crawled onto the foot of my bed. As it moved, it left scorched, black handprints on my white duvet. I could smell it now, the scent of burning hair and old, rancid fat. They sent me up. The soot thing croaked, its ember eyes narrowing. They tied the rope to my ankles and pushed me into the heat. They said I'd get a shilling if I cleaned the bend. But I got stuck, master. The brick moved. I heard my ribs snap like dry kindling. The sound of a heavy thump against stone, repeated 3 times. I realized then what I was looking at. This house wasn't just built of stone and mortar. In the Victorian era, climbing boys, were sent up these chimneys to scrape the soot. Many never came back down. They were built into the very bones of the house, their screams muffled by the soot. "I'm sorry," I gasped, my throat tightening as if it were filling with ash. "I didn't know." "You bought the dead," the thing hissed. It leaned closer, and I felt the blistering heat radiating from its face. "And the dead is paid in breath." Suddenly, the room was filled with them. Sound. Dozens of small, scratching footsteps on the walls and ceiling. Dozens of soot-covered silhouettes began to crawl out of the walls, the floorboards, and the ceiling. They were everywhere, a dark, chattering tide of shadows. They didn't attack. They just surrounded me. They began to touch me. Their hands were freezing and searing all at once. Everywhere they touched, my skin turned black and flaky. I tried to scream, but as I opened my mouth, a stream of hot, dry soot poured in, choking the sound in my throat. "Wait!" I managed to wheeze. The sudden, deafening sound of a fireplace damper slamming shut. The main soot thing leaned into my ear. "We've been in the dark for 200 years, Master. It's your turn to find the bend in the chimney." The floor beneath my bed suddenly gave way, not into the room below, but into a narrow, vertical shaft of soot-stained brick. I fell, the air rushing past me, smelling of smoke. I didn't hit the bottom. I got stuck. The walls pressed in on all sides. I could feel the rough bricks scraping against my shoulders. I couldn't move my arms. I couldn't turn my head. It was pitch black, and the air was thick with the dust of 1,000 fires. A muffled, distant sound of a hammer hitting a nail. I heard voices. Distant. Modern. "Yeah, the previous owner just vanished," a man said. "Left everything. We're going to seal up these old fireplaces. They're a fire hazard anyway. Get the bricks and the mortar ready." "No." I tried to scream. "I'm in here. I'm still here." But all that came out was a soft, dry puff of soot. I felt the first brick being laid at the bottom of the flue. Then another, and another. The light from below was being cut off, one layer at a time. Now, I wait in the dark. My skin is becoming dry and flaky. My eyes are starting to glow like dying coals. And sometimes, when the new owners walk past the wall, I reach out and scratch the stone. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I'm just waiting for them to send someone up to check the blockage. Smiley face, the sound of a final brick being tapped into place. Silence. A secluded, modernized farmhouse on the edge of a cornfield in Oak Haven, Nebraska. I bought the farm for the privacy, but I didn't realize the irrigation system under the floorboards was actually a network of veins waiting for a fresh pulse. The dry, rhythmic rustling of tall corn stalks in the wind. A distant, metallic creak of a weather vane. They say the soil in Nebraska is the richest in the world. They don't tell you what makes it so dark. I moved into the Miller place in late August. It was a sleek, black-timbered farmhouse, a modern industrial dream dropped into the middle of 300 acres of gold. I'm a software developer. I wanted the silence. I wanted to sit on my porch with a laptop and see nothing but the horizon. But the horizon in the Midwest doesn't feel like an edge. It feels like a lid. A low, subterranean rumble, like a distant freight train underground. It started with the thumping. Every night at exactly 11:11 p.m., a vibration would start in the soles of my feet. It wasn't the plumbing, and it wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, organic thud coming from the root cellar beneath the kitchen. The cellar was the only part of the house I hadn't renovated. It was a damp, stone-lined hole accessible by a heavy wooden hatch. The previous owner had padlocked it and painted a strange, white symbol on the wood, a circle with 3 lines crossing through it. Naturally, I cut the lock. The sharp clink of bolt cutters, followed by the heavy groan of old hinges. The air that hit me wasn't musty. It was sweet, cloyingly sweet, like rotting peaches and copper. I shone my flashlight down the stone steps. The walls weren't covered in mold. They were covered in roots. But they weren't coming from outside. They were growing into the earth from the house. Long, pale, hair-like fibers that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. "Just some invasive species," I muttered, my heart doing a nervous dance. I reached out to touch one. The moment my finger brushed the fiber, it winced. It pulled back into a crack in the stone like a startled worm. A sharp, wet hiss, the sound of air being sucked through a small gap. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the hatch. My smart home app started glitching. The thermostat kept climbing, 75, 80, 90 degrees. The house was running a fever. Then, the kitchen floor began to bleed. Not red blood. A thick, amber sap started oozing from the gaps in the floorboards. It was sticky, and as it hit the air, it began to harden into something that looked like translucent bone. I need to get out, I thought. I grabbed my car keys, but as I reached for the front door, the wood didn't feel like wood. It felt like muscle. The handle was warm, and when I turned it, the door didn't open. It tightened. A heavy, wet squelch, followed by the sound of something large dragging across the floor. "Hello, Thomas," a voice whispered. I screamed, spinning around. The voice didn't come from a person. It came from the walls. The amber sap on the floor was vibrating, forming shapes, vaguely human faces that rose and sank in the liquid like bubbles in boiling tar. "The harvest is late," the walls groaned. "The Miller family kept us fed. They understood the contract. But you brought us nothing but electricity and cold glass." I realized then why the Miller family had sold the house for a pittance. They hadn't escaped. They had traded the house to someone else to take their place in the cycle. The sound of the kitchen hatch slamming open against the floor. Out of the cellar came the roots. They weren't just fibers anymore. They were thick, trunk-like tendrils, and they were dragging something up from the dark. It was a skeleton, but it wasn't dead. It was encased in that amber sap, its ribcage filled with pulsing, glowing tubers. Its jaw was unhinged, held in place by vines. It moved toward me with a jerky, clicking gait. "We need a new heart," the thing wheezed. "The house is hungry, Thomas. It hasn't tasted a pulse in 3 months." I scrambled back, tripping over the kitchen island. I grabbed a kitchen knife, but as I stabbed at a reaching vine, the blade didn't cut. The vine simply wrapped around the steel and absorbed it. The metal melted into the plant matter like sugar in tea. The sound of glass shattering, the large floor-to-ceiling windows. The corn from outside was coming in. The stalks were smashing through the windows, their sharp, serrated leaves slicing through the air. They weren't just plants, they were extensions of the house. I was pushed toward the cellar opening. I looked down into the pit. It wasn't a room anymore. It was a stomach, a vast, wet cavern of red soil and white, reaching fingers. "No, please," I begged. "Don't worry, Thomas," the walls whispered, the amber sap now rising to my knees, pinning me to the spot. "You'll love the view from the grain. You'll be the golden stalks. You'll be the bread. You'll be eternal." The floorboards under me dissolved. I didn't fall fast. I was lowered. The slow, rhythmic thump-thump of a massive heart, now very close. I felt the roots enter my skin. They didn't hurt. They felt like a cold numbing agent. They slid into my veins, replacing my blood with that sweet, copper sap. My vision began to turn gold. I could feel the sun on my leaves, even though I was underground. I could feel the rain miles away. I am the house now. I can feel the new couple walking through the front door today. They're from Chicago. They think the amber-colored wood in the kitchen is a stunning design choice. They're talking about putting a nursery in the spare room. I try to move the door handle. I try to make it cold. I try to warn them. But all I can do is thump. Pause. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. I hope they're hungry, because the harvest is finally here. The sound of a child's laughter, followed by the sharp, echoing thump from below the floor. A luxury loft converted from a Victorian-era isolation hospital in East London. My new apartment was a Victorian hospital for the incurable, and I just found out why my bedroom door only locks from the outside. The distant, muffled roar of London traffic. The high-pitched whine of a sleek, modern elevator. They called it the Sanctuary, a gated community of high-end lofts in the heart of Hackney. To the hipsters and bankers moving in, it was the ultimate status symbol. Exposed brick, industrial beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows. To the old-timers in the pub across the street, it was still the pest house. I didn't care about the history. I was a junior partner at a law firm, and I wanted a space that screamed success. My unit, for B, was the crown jewel, the former surgery wing. The beep of an electronic keypad. A heavy metal door sliding shut. The first week was perfect. The air was sterile, the lighting was recessed, and the soundproofing was so good I couldn't even hear the sirens on the street. But on the 8th night, the sterile smell changed. It started as a faint whiff of carbolic soap and scorched hair. I was sitting on my designer velvet sofa, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, when the smart lighting dimmed. I hadn't touched the app. Lights to 50%, I commanded. A sharp, electric pop, the buzz of a failing filament. Instead of brightening, the lights began to strobe. Flash, dark, flash, dark. In those split seconds of light, I saw the room change. My marble kitchen island didn't look like marble in the strobe. It looked like a rusted, zinc-topped operating table. My plush rug looked like a pile of discarded, blood-stained bandages. System lights off. I yelled, my heart hammering. The lights died. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep-sea water. The slow, rhythmic clack-clack of metal wheels on a hard floor. Clack-clack, clack-clack. It was the sound of a gurney. I could hear the squeak of a rusted wheel, moving slowly down my open-plan hallway. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting a frantic circle through the dark. The hallway was empty, but as I panned the light down, I saw tracks in the pristine white dust of the floor. Parallel lines, as if something heavy had been rolled through. Is someone there? I called out. Pause. I'm calling security. I pulled up the building's internal security app. I clicked on the camera for my own living room. My breath hitched. On the screen, I was standing alone. But next to me, a figure was visible in the infrared. It was a nurse, but she wasn't wearing a modern uniform. She wore a heavy, dark gown and a stiff white cap that shadowed her face. She was holding a long, brass needle, and she was looking directly into the camera lens. The phone emits a burst of static and a distorted, female voice. Patient 4B is agitated, the phone whispered. Administer the sedative. I dropped the phone. It shattered on the floor. I ran for the front door, but as my hand hit the handle, I realized the electronic lock was dead. No, it wasn't dead. It was inverted. The heavy, mechanical clunk of a deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. In the Victorian era, the incurables weren't guests, they were prisoners. And my luxury loft had just reverted to its original programming. I turned around, and the modern walls were gone. The gray paint was peeling back in real time, revealing moss green tiles and iron gas lamp brackets. The floor was no longer polished oak. It was cold, wet concrete. A chorus of muffled, hacking coughs coming from behind every wall. The coughing grew louder. It wasn't one person, it was hundreds. The sound of a city's worth of plague and misery, all trapped in the mortar of my home. I'm not sick, I screamed, backing into the kitchen. I just moved in. There's been a mistake. A shadow fell across the floor. The nurse from the camera was standing in the archway. Up close, I could see she had no eyes, only deep, charred sockets filled with the same carbolic soap I'd smelled earlier. All who enter the ward are sick, she said. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It came from the vents. The city is a fever. This building is the cure. The metallic clinking of surgical instruments being laid out on a tray. I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I looked down. Small, pale hands were reaching out from under the marble island, which was now a cold, stone slab. They were the hands of children, their skin covered in the telltale black spots of the Great Plague. They were pulling at my trousers, dragging me down. No, get off me. I kicked out, but my leg felt heavy, numb. I looked at my arm. Under the skin, I could see things moving. Long, thin shapes like needles were sliding through my veins. The renovation is almost complete, the nurse whispered. She leaned over me, the brass needle glinting in the dark. We don't just change the walls, Mr. Thorne. We change the inhabitants. You are the new specimen 4B. A wet, tearing sound, followed by the sound of a heavy saw cutting through bone. I tried to scream, but the nurse placed a cold, wet cloth over my face. It smelled of ether and death. My vision began to spiral into a black pinpoint. The last thing I heard was the sound of the elevator bell. Ding. And this, the estate agent's voice said, sounding miles away, is the master suite. Note the original Victorian features. It really gives the place a sense of history. It's beautiful, a woman replied. But what's that smell? Is that carbolic soap? Just the cleaning crew, ma'am. They're very thorough here. The sound of a bedsheet being pulled over a face. I tried to move, to shout, to tell the new buyers that I was right there, under the floorboards, sewn into the very fabric of the room. But I couldn't move. I was just another original feature, and I could feel the fever starting to burn. a distant, echoing cough that ends in a wet rattle. A passive house with panoramic glass walls suspended over a ravine in the Olympic Peninsula, Washington. I built a house with no walls so I could watch the forest, but I forgot that out here, the trees have been watching us for 1,000 years, and they're finally hungry. The deep, resonant creaking of ancient cedars, the distant, lonely cry of an owl, the hum of a high-tech air filtration system. The architect called it the canopy. It was a marvel of cantilevered steel and triple-paned glass, hovering 60 feet above the forest floor. The idea was to live with nature, not against it. No curtains, no blinds, just me and the endless, moss-draped cathedral of the Washington wilderness. Moving in was a dream. By day, I felt like I was floating. By night, it was like being suspended in an inkwell. The sharp, wet thwack of something hitting glass, like a heavy piece of fruit. I was in the kitchen on the 4th night, brewing a cup of coffee to keep me awake through a late-night coding session. Thwack! I jumped, spilling hot water on the counter. I looked at the window, facing the deep ravine. There, stuck to the outside of the glass, was a clump of wet moss. It was shaped like a hand, 5 long, spindly fingers splayed out against the pane. Gravity, I muttered, my heart racing. Just a clump of moss falling from a higher branch. But as I watched, the hand moved. Pause. It didn't slide down. It dragged itself upward, leaving a trail of dark, green slime on the pristine glass. A low, vibrating hum that seems to come from the ground itself. I grabbed my high-powered tactical flashlight and shone it out into the dark. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the trunks of the old-growth cedars. The trees were closer. I know how that sounds. I'm a man of logic and mathematics. But I had measured the distance from the deck to the nearest tree on moving day. It was 32 feet. Now, the gnarled branches of a massive Douglas fir were scraping against the steel support beams of the house. The screech of metal on wood, a long, agonizing grind. Suddenly, the house's smart alert system chimed. Proximity alert. Exterior obstruction detected. I ran to the master bedroom, which overhung the steepest part of the ravine. I looked down through the floor viewing pane. My breath caught. The forest floor was gone. It wasn't just dark, it was moving. A sea of gray, tangled roots was coiling around the stilts of the house like giant pythons. They weren't just touching the steel, they were crushing it. The glass beneath my feet began to spiderweb with tiny, white fractures. The sound of glass ticking as it begins to crack under pressure. Home system, emergency lights. I yelled. The exterior floodlights flickered on, bathing the forest in a harsh, artificial white. That's when I saw them. They weren't people. They were shapes, tall, elongated silhouettes made of bark, lichen, and black sap. They were standing on the branches of the trees that now surrounded the house. They didn't have faces, just hollow knots in the wood where eyes should be. One of them was standing right outside the kitchen glass. It leaned its head against the pane. A sound like 1,000 dry leaves rustling at once, forming words. The wood returns. It whispered. The voice didn't come from the air. It vibrated directly through the glass into my skull. You built your nest with the bones of our brothers. I looked at the beautiful, reclaimed oak floors I had been so proud of. I looked at the cedar-clad ceiling. Every piece of wood in the house began to weep. A dark, sticky resin started oozing from the knots in the floorboards. It smelled of ancient rot and fresh pine. A sudden, violent crack as a structural steel beam snaps. The house tilted. I was thrown against the glass wall. I looked out and saw the forest moving in unison. The trees weren't just closer, they were closing in. The branches were weaving together, forming a cage of thorns and needles around the glass box. Please, I screamed, hammering on the glass. I'll leave. I'll tear it down. Too late, the rustling voice replied. The sap is hungry. The roots are dry. You are the nitrogen we've been waiting for. The floor viewing pane shattered. The explosive crash of thick glass falling into the abyss. I scrambled to grab the kitchen island as the house groaned, leaning at a 45-degree angle. From the hole in the floor, the roots began to climb. They weren't slow anymore. They moved like whips, green and wet, coiling around my ankles. I tried to reach for a knife, but the reclaimed oak cabinets reached out first. The wood softened, turning into a pulpy, tooth-filled maw that clamped down on my wrist. The sound of a person gasping for air, stifled by something wet. I wasn't being killed, I was being planted. The roots pulled me down toward the hole. I looked out the glass wall one last time. The forest was silent now. The wood things were gone. There was only the green, suffocating wall of needles pressing against the glass. The house gave one final, tectonic shiver and collapsed into the ravine. But it didn't hit the ground. It was caught by the trees. I'm still here. I'm suspended 60 feet in the air, encased in a cocoon of steel, glass, and living root. My legs have already started to harden. My skin is turning the color of lichen. I can feel the nutrients being sucked out of my marrow, replaced by the slow, cold pulse of the forest. A heartbeat, but incredibly slow, one beat every 10 seconds. Yesterday, a hiker passed by. He looked up and saw the ruins of the glass canopy tangled in the trees. He took a photo. He thought it was a poetic statement on the fragility of man. He didn't see me behind the cracked glass. He didn't see my eye, the only thing I can still move, following him. I hope he comes back with a shovel, not to dig me out. Pause, but because the forest is still hungry and I'm almost empty. The sound of a single leaf falling and hitting a glass surface. Silence. The Orchards, a sprawling new-build development in Ohio, USA. I bought the perfect house in a neighborhood where every home is identical, but I just realized I've been walking into my neighbor's house for 3 days, and he hasn't noticed because he's made of drywall. The distant, rhythmic chirping of a cricket, the hum of an outdoor AC unit. A dog barks once, sounding miles away. They call it the Orchards. There are no trees here, only rows of pristine, beige and gray houses that look like they were birthed from the same 3D printer. I bought number 114 because it was turnkey. I wanted a life where nothing was broken, where the lawn was always a perfect 3 inches, and the neighbors were as quiet as the grave. I got exactly what I asked for. That was the problem. The beep of a car's remote lock. Footsteps on a concrete driveway. I came home late from the office on a Tuesday. The streetlights in the Orchards are a blinding, artificial white. I pulled into the driveway of 114, keyed the code into the garage, and walked inside. The house smelled of new home. That mixture of fresh carpet, paint, and sawdust. I threw my keys on the granite island and went to the fridge. The hum of a refrigerator, the clink of a glass bottle. I was halfway through a beer when I noticed the photo on the counter. It was a picture of a family, a man, a woman, and a golden retriever. They were standing in front of this very kitchen island. I don't have a wife, I thought, and I definitely don't have a dog. I looked around. Everything was identical to my house. The same bar stools, the same stainless steel appliances, the same live, laugh, love sign I'd ironically bought for the hallway. I checked the mail on the counter. It was addressed to a Mark Henderson. My name is David. Oh hell, I muttered, a cold sweat breaking out. I'm in 112 or 116. A soft, muffled thump from upstairs, like a heavy ball being dropped. I grabbed my keys and bolted. I ran out the front door, looking for the house number. The brass plate on the porch said 114. I looked left. The house next door was 114. I looked right. 114. As far as the eye could see under the flickering white streetlights, every single house in the cul-de-sac bore the same number. Is this a prank? I felt the first prickle of true panic. I pulled out my phone to call 911. The electronic bleep of a phone with no service. No signal, I whispered. I started walking down the street, looking for the entrance to the estate. I'd only lived here a week. I knew the way out. Left at the fountain, right at the model home. I walked for 10 minutes. I passed the fountain. Then I passed it again. Pause, and a third time. The Orchards wasn't a neighborhood. It was a loop. The sound of a door opening. A slow, rhythmic creak. One of the front doors of the identical houses swung open. A man stepped out. He was wearing a gray polo shirt and khaki shorts, the suburban uniform. He looked exactly like the man in the photo. He was holding a garden hose. Hey, I shouted, running toward him. Hey, I'm lost. My phone is dead. Which way is the main road? The man turned. He didn't have eyes. He had 2 perfectly round, black holes, as if someone had used a drill bit on his face. His skin didn't look like skin. It looked like textured wallpaper. Welcome home, neighbor, he said. His voice didn't have any inflection. It sounded like a text-to-speech program. Are you enjoying the floor plan? The sound of the garden hose turning on, but the sound is dry, like sand hitting pavement. I didn't answer. I turned and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, passing 114, 114, 114. Every window I passed showed the same scene. A family sitting at a table, eating the same meal, their wallpaper faces illuminated by the blue glow of identical televisions. I ducked into an alleyway between two houses, hoping to find a fence to climb, but there were no fences. A loud, echoing pop, like a balloon bursting. I looked back. The man in the khaki shorts was following me. He wasn't running. He was glitching. One moment he was 30 feet away, the next he was 20, his body flickering like a bad video file. There is an error in the cul-de-sac, he droned. 2 Davids detected. Redundancy must be eliminated. I scrambled back into the nearest house, number 114. I slammed the door and locked it. I ran to the kitchen, looking for a weapon. I grabbed a steak knife from the drawer. The knife hits the counter with a hollow, wooden clack. The knife was fake. It was made of painted plastic, molded into the drawer itself. I tried to grab a chair. It was bolted to the floor. I tried to scream, but the air in the house was becoming thick, like it was being pumped full of insulation. The sound of a key turning in the lock of the front door. The door opened. The man stepped in. Behind him stood the woman and the dog from the photo. They all had the same drill hole eyes. The dog didn't bark. It emitted a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. "David," the woman said, "you forgot to finish your beer." She held up a bottle. It was solid glass. No liquid inside. Just a prop. "Who are you?" I sobbed, backing into the corner of the living room. "What is this place?" "This is the Orchards," they said in unison. "A community designed for maximum efficiency. You were a good template, David. Your credit score was excellent. Your habits were predictable. Thank you for the data." The man reached out a hand, his fingers elongated, turning into long, thin strips of measuring tape. The sound of a tape measure zipping out, fast and sharp. He pressed the tape against my forehead. "Dimensionally sound," he whispered. I felt my skin begin to harden. My joints locked. My thoughts began to fragment into architectural blueprints. I tried to blink, but my eyelids were being fused shut with a substance that felt like quick dry caulk. "Don't worry," the woman whispered, leaning in close. I could smell the new home scent coming from her mouth. "You'll love the new development. We're building 10,000 more of you in North Carolina." The sound of a heavy plastic sheet being pulled over a piece of furniture. I'm standing in the window of 114 now. I can't move my arms. I can't move my legs. I am a model resident. Across the street, I see a car pull into the driveway. A man gets out. He looks tired. He looks like he's looking for a fresh start. He looks just like I did. He looks up at my window. I try to scream. I try to wave. But all I can do is stand perfectly still, a permanent, painted smile on my wallpaper face. The beep of a car's remote lock. The cycle begins again. A brutalist, concrete, eco-home built onto a private tidal island off the coast of Skye, Scotland. I bought a house that only connects to the mainland at low tide. But tonight the tide didn't just come in. It brought something up from the abyss that's been knocking on the floorboards for 3 hours. The violent, crashing roar of the Atlantic. The high-pitched scream of a gale-force wind. The rhythmic thump of a heavy buoy bell in the distance. They call it the monolith. It's a masterpiece of glass and reinforced concrete, bolted directly into the jagged basalt of a tiny tidal skerry. For 6 hours a day, a narrow stone causeway connects it to the Isle of Skye. For the other 18, you are a prisoner of the Atlantic. I'm a writer. I told my agent I needed the divine isolation to finish my novel. I wanted the spray on the windows and the sound of the abyss. I didn't realize that when you stare at the abyss for long enough, it starts looking for a way inside. The muffled, heavy clunk of the tide hitting the base of the house. The house was designed to be floodproof. The ground floor is a reinforced concrete shell, with the living quarters suspended above. On the first night of the spring tide, the water rose higher than the architect's projections. I was sitting in the dark, watching the waves churn just inches below the floor-viewing glass in the living room. Pause. Then, the clinking started. A sharp, metallic scraping against concrete, like a knife on a plate. It wasn't the water. It was rhythmic. Something was submerged, clinging to the concrete pilings of my house. I grabbed my torch and shone it through the floor glass. The water was black and frothing, but just beneath the surface, I saw a hand. It was huge, the size of a dinner plate, with translucent, gray skin and webbing that looked like rotted lace. It was clutching the concrete, its long, jagged nails carving deep grooves into the indestructible pillars. "Just a seal," I whispered, my voice trembling. "A big, deformed bull seal." A sudden, massive thud that shakes the entire house. The sound of glass vibrating. The house groaned. The smart sensors in the walls began to wail. Structural integrity compromised. Leak detected in sublevel 1. I didn't have a sublevel. The house was built on solid rock. I ran to the utility closet where the basement hatch was located. The previous owner had told me it was just a crawl space for the plumbing. I ripped it open. The sound of rushing water and a wet, sucking noise. The crawl space was a sea cave. The house hadn't been built on the rock. It had been built over a blowhole. And as the tide rose, something was being pushed up through the throat of the island. The smell hit me first: brine, ancient kelp, and something like a whale carcass left in the sun. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a whistle. A high-pitched, melodic trill that made my ears bleed. A piercing, distorted whistle that fluctuates in pitch. I looked down into the hatch. In the beam of my torch, I saw them. They were pale, bloated things, half human, half deep-sea nightmare. Their eyes were huge, milky orbs that reflected no light. They weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. "It's a new home," one of them trilled. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It came from a slit in its neck, vibrating like a cello string. A new shell for the king. I slammed the hatch and dragged a heavy oak chest over it. But the water was already bubbling up through the floor vents. It wasn't salt water. It was thick, black oil. The sound of glass shattering, the massive floor-viewing pain. The ocean didn't just pour in, it exploded upward. The pressure of the tide had finally shattered the glass. I was thrown back as the living room turned into a whirlpool of freezing Atlantic water and jagged shards. I scrambled up the spiral staircase to the bedroom, the water chasing me, rising a foot every second. I reached the top and slammed the heavy steel door, bolting it shut. Silence, except for the heavy breathing of the narrator and the muffled roar of the sea below. I was trapped. The tide wouldn't turn for another 4 hours. Thump. Something hit the bedroom door. Not a hand. A shoulder. Thump. Thump. "Elias," the whistling voice called through the keyhole. "The stone is cold. Your blood is warm. Give us the warmth." I backed away toward the balcony, but the gale force winds outside would blow me into the rocks in seconds. I looked at the floorboards of my bedroom. Small, white worms were crawling out from between the cracks. They weren't worms. They were the fingers of the things below, thin and needle-sharp, poking through the wood like hair through skin. "The house is a cage," I screamed. "The house is a bait box," the voice replied. The sound of the steel door groaning, the hinges starting to pop. The water began to seep under the door. It was glowing now, a sickly, bioluminescent blue. In the light, I saw the walls of my bedroom change. The minimalist gray paint was dissolving, revealing that the concrete wasn't concrete at all. It was compressed bone, thousands of skeletons, ground down and molded into the shape of a house. I realized then why the price had been so low, why the architect had disappeared. The monolith wasn't a home for people. It was a lure built by the sea to bring fresh marrow to the scaries. Every 10 years, a new owner. Every 10 years, a new layer of concrete. The final, explosive crash of the door giving way. The things flooded in. They didn't have feet. They moved like eels, their gray bodies shimmering in the blue light. They surrounded the bed, their milky eyes fixed on my chest. "Welcome home, Elias," the largest one said, its neck slit vibrating with a wet, happy sound. "You're going to make a beautiful chimney." I felt the first cold, webbed hand touch my throat. It didn't squeeze. It absorbed. My skin began to turn gray, my lungs filled with the scent of the deep. The sound of a person struggling to breathe underwater, bubbles, and a final, muffled cry. The next morning, the tide went out. The causeway was clear. A local fisherman sailed past the monolith. He saw the sun glinting off the windows. He saw a man standing on the balcony, waving a hand. The fisherman waved back. He didn't notice that the man on the balcony didn't have eyes. He didn't notice that the man was standing perfectly still, His feet fused into the concrete of the railing, and he certainly didn't notice the new, white grooves in the pillars, the shape of 10 human fingers, reaching for a mainland that was no longer there. The buoy bell tolls one last time, fades to the sound of waves,